welcome everybody. While people might still be walking in, but welcome everybody to this webinar organized by the Institute for IT Professionals, the IITPSA. This webinar is organized by the Social and Ethics Committee. This is the second webinar that we're organizing this year on the topic of ethics, following the introduction of the new Code of Ethics for the IITPSA. For people who joined us before with our webinar in August with Paul Forster from the Ethics Institute, I remember that we promised that we would follow up with Paul Forster. We would have a second webinar because everybody got so excited about everything that Paul had to share that we ran out of time. But Paul is very busy. I think that only goes to show what a relevant topic ethics is at the moment, and also in South Africa. But he's promised, so he wasn't available for another webinar this year, but he promised to be with us early next year. So those of you who are waiting for the second webinar by Paul Forster of the Ethics Institute, do not worry, Paul will be back with us. But today we've got a very special speaker. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce to you Arthur Gwagwa. Arthur is from Zimbabwe, but he's currently doing a doctoral or his Ph.D. at the University of Utrecht, or Utrecht, but I'm from the Netherlands. So in a way, we had a nice introduction talk. I moved from the global north to the global south, and Arthur had the opposite move. And we talked about how interesting that actually is to be exposed to the different value systems on both parts of the world. So Arthur had written a very interesting article that I came across about the relevance of Ubuntu and African values to be included in the global artificial intelligence ethics discourse and talk about inclusion. And I thought that would be relevant for us. When I came across the article, it's written from a philosophical perspective. Arthur is a philosopher and researcher in ethics. So it's a bit more philosophical. He also speaks about the role of African philosophers in making sure that these values are included in the discourse. And I said, but what about the African IT professionals, people who design and develop and implement artificial intelligence, who are looking at data sets, who are working with data, who are looking at algorithms and things like that? How can they play a role in making sure that African values also become part of this global discourse? So before I start talking too much myself, I'm very pleased to hand over to Arthur, and I look forward to an interesting conversation. So what we're going to do is that Arthur will just, he's an experienced presenter, so he will just dive right into it. What I'll do is I'll check the chats. I'll switch off my camera, and as soon, you can post your questions in the chat. Arthur, are you also open to having people ask questions themselves? Do you want me to ask the questions for them? What would you prefer? Okay, I can't hear you, Arthur.
I think it's best if the questions come from you, but
Okay.
also I don't mind if the questions come from the public.
Okay. Yeah. So what we'll do is I'll keep an eye on the chats and the hands that are up. I'll switch off my camera, but as soon as I ask a question, I'll switch my camera on so that everybody knows that we're gonna interrupt in the discussion. So if you're happy with it, then I'd like to say over to you, Arthur, and welcome.
Thank you. Um, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining. I'm currently in Utrecht. It's a beautiful day. And I think, it's the coincidence is not when I wrote this paper, which is the subject of today's discussion. I was working in South Africa for RIA in Cape Town. So I wrote, the first paper when I was a fellow under the Microsoft fellowship. And so the first paper wasn't even philosophical, wasn't really like an ethical paper. I was looking at the concept of inclusion in the fourth industrial revolution for different African communities. More, I think, looking at their concept of inclusion from a social work or sociological perspective. And then that paper, when I started working with a team at the University College London during the COVID time, they said, oh, hey, I think this paper has got potential. Why don't we put a spin on it and make it a little bit ethical, philosophical ethics of technology. Then, the paper was, published last year. So thanks, to my co-authors, Ailey Hilliard and Emre Kazim, who managed, to edit the paper for me and make it what it is. So I think when I spoke to Josine, she introduced me to their code of ethics, South African code of ethics for their ICT professionals. And she also taught me that there are quite a number of Indians who abide by that code, because South Africa sources some of its technology from India, which is actually very, very interesting, given, I think, the history that we are seeing unfolding in London today, the tables, turning, that, the former colonized are becoming the leaders in one of the most powerful countries in the world. But I think, allow me to also, I think, go back in time, like maybe 2 centuries ago, 3 centuries ago, or 50 years ago, 60 years ago. South Africa and India have had very strong relationships, very strong relationships. And one of the documentaries that I used to read about Mahatma Gandhi is that Mahatma Gandhi spent quite a bit of time in Cape Town. So it really shows me the similarities in our cultures, that our cultures have mutually reinforced each other over the centuries. So Ubuntu, if I were to go to India today, I think Ubuntu is as applicable as it is, to South Africa, to Zimbabwe, to Africans. So we share a lot in common. So my starting point, I'm not really going to get into the details of the paper itself, but I think skating around, talking about issues generally, and throwing in some stories and some anecdotes to understand what exactly Ubuntu is and the role it should or it could play in the development of technology, particularly in the digital era. So my starting point is that I think Africa has unfinished business with its pre-colonial heritage. So in as much as I chide, the colonists, saying that, oh, it is because of the colonial past that Africa is where it is. But I also believe that as Africans, we should be cognizant of our heritage, that as we are creating new, as we are entering the fourth industrial revolution, which is underpinned by artificial intelligence and big data, we shouldn't lose sight of our past. So as one hand is reaching forward into the era of modernity, another hand should be reaching backwards in order for us to have a perfect connection between our heritage and innovation. Because our heritage has not only been important in what's happening in Africa now, but in their global developments. I think I was reading about slavery. The first ship of slaves, to go to the state, to their colony of Virginia, was it in 1619? was that of Angolans. And Angolans, about 20 Angolans contributed so much to the county of Virginia. Back then, some of them were introduced, peanut butter. Some of them were artisans. Some of them actually introduced, Christianity to their county of Virginia. And then when we're looking at Africans today in Europe, we see a lot of African footballers, but Africans in the diaspora, American diaspora, were very good musicians. So Africa as a continent, or Africans as a people, have contributed so much to the well-being of the world, or to civilization. But I think what is actually surprising is that as Africans, sometimes we don't take innovation seriously. I was reading an excerpt from a book by Chakaneza Mavunga, who is equally Zimbabwean at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Chakaneza said, until outsiders take what we have and use it and make money out of it, that's when we start complaining. We see African historians writing books. They leave, the books there. We mine ore, we separate minerals in our furnaces and purify the minerals, but make little out of those minerals. Whether it's research or extracting ore from the ground, we don't even make we don't even make movies out of our books. We don't make cars or cell phones out of our minerals. But we are just good at the first stages of production. I think much more important in fourth industrial revolution, we are a continent that is actually very rich in cultural heritage, in theories and philosophies. But all that I hear at the moment is that artificial intelligence is all about algorithms, is about big data. But the countries, or the countries that are racing ahead in artificial intelligence, actually have a national narrative. Whether you go to China, whether it's the US, or whether it's smaller countries that are making good progress in artificial intelligence, they have certain theories, they have certain beliefs, they have certain outlooks of life, certain beliefs. So artificial intelligence is not just about the algorithms, about data analytics, about the data, but it is also about the philosophy, the outlook, the outlook or the philosophical outlook of life that a particular social group have. When we are talking of China, for example, China has got a history of being oppressed, has got a history of being embarrassed and of being humiliated, but it has got a history of people who come together, to do things together. And we are seeing that coming through and through in the way China is developing its artificial intelligence. So let me just, give three ethical dilemmas to make, my presentation more real. So these three ethical dilemmas, I would like to invite those who are working in the ICT sectors to think of your code of ethics, but also to think of Ubuntu and reflect on these three ethical dilemmas that I'm going to give you. One, you are working for an electronics company and your manager asks you to help design a fridge with cameras and sensors that can monitor how and what the prospective buyer is, and to manufacture a Roomba robot, cleaning robot that can send a map of a customer's home back to you, or without a customer's consent. What are you going to do? The second scenario is you are leading a government task force on the integration of minority groups into the mainstream community, into the mainstream communities. You are asked to design a database and data collection tools to harvest all the intellectual knowledge of this indigenous group without their consent, cooperation, or without paying them. What do you do? And then the third scenario that I'm going to give, you have been appointed in your country's ethical digital transformation team the team agrees to allow the 5 major corporations in your country to go and harvest all the biometric data from the neighboring countries. And in turn, they are going to offer the government of that particular country high-tech equipment to surveil on its own people. You know, as a professional, that this deal will enable your country to go ahead in the global AI race. What would you do? So these scenarios, the first scenario is what I call microethics. It's on a micro level. You are an employee in a big IT company who is manufacturing a product, and you've been asked to do something that is unethical, to harvest data from the customers without their consent. And then the second scenario, where it is at international level, that is a macro level. That is macro level, where the government is harvesting information or indigenous knowledge without the consent of the group concerned. And then the third scenario that I've given is in the realm of international relations, the global AI race, where other countries are harvesting biometric data from the global south, especially Africa, without compensating the African social groups from whom the data is being harvested. So these are real ethical dilemmas that you're likely to face once you start, for those who are still in school practicing as an ICT professional, for those who are already ICT professionals, once you start working on real concrete issues. So from these examples that I've given, what exactly is ethics? So we want to understand what ethics is before we discuss the contents of my paper. So ethics is the philosophy of human conduct. It addresses the question, how should we act? So throughout the history of mankind, the repertoire of our actions that is available to us were very limited. So the way of answering that question, how should we act, was very simple, because we knew that the consequences of our actions were constrained in scope, and the impact through dispersed power structures and slow trade. But today, because of artificial intelligence, because of the algorithms, our world is becoming more and more globalized and networked, which means that a decision can affect billions of people instantaneously and have tremendous complex repercussions. Machine learning algorithms are replacing humans in making some of these consequential decisions that affect our everyday life. So how do we decide how machine learning algorithms and their designers should act? What is the ethics of today, and what would it be for the future? So these are questions that are becoming relevant because of artificial intelligence, because back then, before artificial intelligence, ethical decisions were much more localized. We knew how to make certain decisions. If a stranger comes into the village, the village elders would come together and form a committee and deliberate under the tree to say, well, what are we going to do with this stranger? Are we going to allow this stranger to become part of us? Are we going to give land to this stranger? Or are we going to tell the stranger to go back to where they came from? But today we've got a situation where we've got sentient AI and algorithms. If a machine learning algorithm that makes decisions of consequences come among us, what are we going to do? Are we going to tell the algorithm to go back to where it was designed? Obviously, that is impossible because of the reach of digital information, because of the nature of how algorithms and artificial intelligence work. Because they work cross-border, they do not need a passport or a visa. So these are concrete questions that are facing African governments today, where African governments, African policymakers are fumbling for answers to say, should we tax the the fragments, that is the big tech companies. If we were to tax Facebook, how do we do it? Should we punish Google? If we're to do it, how are we going to do it? So these are very fundamental questions that is changing, the face of ethics. So how have other jurisdictions or other cultures dealt with these moral issues? For example, in America, 4 years ago, in California, the California law enforcement wanted to crack, the encryption of the Apple products in order for them to access information to catch, some criminals. So that is an ethical dilemma on its own. Should we, is the goal of catching criminals more important than data privacy? So in other cultures, they've employed moral theories, consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics in order to solve such moral issues. But in the context of Africa, what do we do? Then we've got Ubuntu, and then we've got the code of ethics. Let me just go quickly to the code of ethics, to your code of ethics. So the code of ethics for the Institute of Information Technology in South Africa, one, it talks about contributing to society and human well-being. Secondly, it talks about avoiding harm. And then in terms of, it talks about analysis of possible risks and to ensure that, ICT professionals makes, products that are robust and usably secure. So in its preamble, the code specifically mentions that the public good is paramount consideration. Work of ICT professionals should contribute to society and to human well-being. In terms of compliance, it states that ICT professionals should go beyond mere compliance, but should work to correct situations where the principles are not being followed. Computing professionals' actions changes the world. So they should reflect upon the impact of their work, consistently supporting public good as the basis for ethical decision-making. And what is public good? The Code of Ethics talks about being careful, thoughtful consideration of the ethical principles, understanding that public good is the paramount, consideration. So I think what I take out of this code are two important pillars. One, that there's two important pillars, that is advancing public good and avoiding harm. And that people, that is general people who are outside the ICT professionals, are an important constituency to take into account when applying the Code of Ethics. So when we take the Code of the Code of Ethics and try to apply it, to the scenarios that I spoke about, that I read out at the beginning. How do we apply such a code, taking into account that we are in a country that believes in the principle of Ubuntu? So let me just, pause. So there are decisions that affect a community as a whole. That affects, for example, if there is a decision by your government to deploy a large-scale technology development that affects, the whole community. An example being biometric database, facial recognition technologies. And we know that, these technologies are going to harvest data, they are going to be infringing on our privacy. How do you advise the government to uphold public good and to minimize harm or to avoid harm? Any takers? Are there any takers, anyone who might want to? We know this is already happening in Kenya. This is happening in a number of African countries where China is being contracted. Chinese corporations are coming to set up some biometric databases. Facial recognition technologies are being rolled out in order for data to be harvested, supposedly for the improvements of public services. But we also know the dark underbelly of those technologies. So if you are an ICT professional who wants to advance, the two pillars of the code of ethics, one, public good and avoiding harm, what sort of considerations should we take into account in advising the government to make sure that the biometric and facial recognition technology program does not cause harm, but it advances public good?
Yeah, Arthur, I've got a taker, I see. Saba.
Yes.
Saba, you want to add yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I think that we're still very, thank you very much for everything so far. It's been very interesting. I think that in South Africa, we've got the POPIA regulation. I know the GDPR in Europe, but we're still very naive with our sort of legislation around things like this. And I think that a concern about biometric data, there's legislation in South Africa that says you can't make a prejudicial judgment against somebody automatically. So if the AI says this person is dodgy, there is South African regulations and which says you cannot make a prejudicial judgment against that person. You can flag and say, make a decision about this, but you can't automatically exclude. I don't think other countries in the world have things like that. And I mean, talking about biometrics and facial recognition and things like that, remember 30 years ago, it was only celebrities who could be harassed and have people stand on the top of the mountain with a big lens this size and zoom in and see what type of underwear they're wearing and put it in the tabloids. Now with social media, that can happen to anybody. So even a picture with is it right to take a picture of someone? We haven't even got that legislation correct. What's your motivation for taking a picture of someone who's on a private boat minding their own business in their bikini or whatever? So now you want to do it on a massive scale. The technology is progressing faster than the ethics. That's my opinion. Sorry.
Right. So that technology is progressing faster, yeah, probably, I think, than the laws, or the laws like POPI and so what it basically means is that in such a situation where the law is not clear, we have left it to technologists to decide the issue on the basis of ethics. But now, there are two considerations. There's a paper that was written by Paul Nemes, that there are certain issues that cannot be left to ethics alone, but they have to be governed by law and human rights law, or law that complies with international human rights standards. So a large scale deployment of technology like biometric databases and facial recognition technologies that affect an entire social group or a society cannot be left to ethics, because it speaks to and it touches on fundamental rights. Yes, of course, I think ethical decisions ethics can be taken into account in making minor decisions, but I think within the realm of the law. In other words, I think the role of ethics is to reinforce fundamental rights as contained in ICCPR and other international human rights conventions. Then I've got another scenario. It's a robot.
So Arthur, we've got two more hands. I think we've got two more people wanting to contribute to your earlier question, if that's okay.
Or let me give this scenario, and then they can just maybe contribute all at once.
Okay.
Then, so
Okay,
I've given an example of what I call a macro ethic, which is a macro project. Then we've got a smaller project, a smaller example of a patient or in a hospital who wants to make a decision on whether they should be independent or whether, and then the hospital or the relatives or the hospital brings a robot that has got sentience, or that can feel pain, that can pass information, and then the robot is going to assist the patient in making decisions. Of course, this decision is not affecting the entire population of South Africa, but it's affecting an individual in a hospital, although the outcome of that decision can actually set precedent across many hospitals. So who is going to assist this patient? So in other words, this robot is going to assist the patient in being autonomous, in making autonomous decisions. So in somewhere in my paper, I talk about relational autonomy. That relational autonomy is part of African African moral philosophy, is part of Ubuntu. That in Africa, writers like Menkiri, like Mpiti, talk so much about community, that a decision about a person's life is made by the community. And then we see Jeche, on the other hand, talking about the limited role of community. And then we are beginning to see other African philosophers who believe that in Africa, we also have the concept of relational autonomy, that in as much as a person makes an individual decision that affects their own life, sometimes they appeal to the community to assist them. So we have got a decision to make about a patient who is in a hospital, whether they should get assistance from a robot that is sentient, that is semi-autonomous. What do we do when we are applying the avoid harm principle and promoting public good in the context of Ubuntu? So the questions can come and also try to address, the second question.
Sorry, I was muted. Nathan Ross, your hand has been up the longest.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Ross. I'm a data and tech lawyer based in Cape Town, South Africa. And my day-to-day work involves helping businesses and governments design, develop, and deploy trustworthy AI. And I'm doing my PhD on a legal framework for AI in South Africa. But basically, I just wanted to say, for analysis purposes, I think we need to separate data and technology from each other. And in a South African context, as Saber rightly mentioned, there is, we're sort of at an advantage because we have a constitutional framework that sort of underpins any piece of legislation. And so we do have robust for data protection legislation, and then also non-discrimination legislation, as well as consumer protection. So they sort of work together to for now at least, to cover the various data and technology concerns related to AI. But when it comes to, but as AI advances, I do think there's a need for a general AI law that will cover the technology itself, which would be separate from the data laws. But again, that law would need to be, you'd need to have general laws and then sector-specific laws. So, for example, in the examples that you mentioned, the medical industry would need laws that would apply to how medicine is administered, how AI is used for that. In a mining and engineering context, you may need a different type of law. But what I've seen is that from an international approach, or what they're calling agile regulation, is that laws, ethics, and standards need to sort of exist with one another so that we can achieve the ends we're trying to achieve. And the basic question that it comes down to is, how do we as human beings see our relationship with technology? What's important, and what are the values that inform that relationship? Like you mentioned Ubuntu, and there are others like Indaba and Imbizo as well that play a relevant role in this. But again, to throw another spanner in the works, whatever regulation takes place needs to consider South Africa, Africa as a whole, and our position in the global community, because there are a lot of opportunities that the fourth industrial revolution brings for South Africa and Africa at large. So there's this need or tension to balance protecting human rights with advancing our economies at the moment. So that's it for me.
Thank you very much. And then, Arthur, you immediately want Claire's input. The second hand is from Claire Thornley, all the way from Dublin.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Josine. Nice to chat to you again. Yeah, I'm for the rest of it, I'm coming to Botswana in the next 2 or 3 weeks, hopefully. So, but I'm not in Africa right now. I'm still in Ireland. So yeah, just some, like I say, I haven't got an answer, but some observations from our work on the European level. I've been involved in ICT ethics and standards for about 10 years now. Just a couple of things that related to what you said, Arthur, that might be helpful to consider. Firstly was, as you said, there is a serious limit to what can be put on the shoulders of a particular ICT professional, and to be aware that even that process is in itself an ethical act, by basically saying to someone who's relatively powerless, it's your job to sort it out. That's a very sort of unempowering and difficult and unhelpful thing to do in many cases, and ignores some of the structural and legal things that have to be in place for those ethical decisions to actually work properly. So just to bring that up, as a broader point about the whole, as you say, complex relationship between law and ethics and standards, I think one thing that can be observed through our experiences is that some of that is down to the checks and balances of the processes. For example, in your example of the robot in the hospital, are you listening to, do you have the process to really listen to patients carefully if people have concerns? I know there was a scandal a few years ago in the UK around using a computer system which ended up putting lots of people that worked in post offices in prison because they thought they'd committed fraud, and they hadn't. People didn't listen to people that worked in post office, so nobody believed that it could be the computer's fault. And I just find it hard to believe that a similar thing would have happened, for example, if the group concerned had been lawyers or surgeons. So I think, acknowledgement of the power of the group that you might be hurting is important too. And just finally, from an EU perspective, it seems to me, as I speak as a non-lawyer, the decision has been, in terms of data ethics, the only way to get companies to comply is to basically give them absolutely enormous fines. And that's what's happened, and it has worked to an extent, but it remains a challenge. For example, in Ireland, we do a lot of business with the USA. Again, we're a comparatively small country, and obviously USA is a very big and rich country. So I recognize some of your concerns there about the balance between developing the economic potential of one's own country while not infringing on rights. So I'll stop there, but just to share some experiences. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think let me just comment briefly on, I think both speakers, I think I like the point about relationship with technology and the values that we put into these technologies, which sort of connects to the issue that I was struggling to put across at the beginning about our own heritage as Africans. I know Africa is too huge to have one heritage, but when I'm talking about common heritage of Africans is who we were, I think, prior to colonialism and what we have contributed to the world. Because I believe that if a number of Africans, if the Angolans who went to Virginia contributed to the economy of Virginia, if Africans like me, like Christy, and footballers that we find in Europe, are coming from Africa and doing amazing stuff, why should we not really be proud of our own heritage and ensure that I think our values are encoded into the technologies that we are making? So it brings us back to the issue that Shakanesa Mavunga at MIT was talking about, that we are not using our resources to make technologies. We are good at mining uranium, and then we send it to Iran, and then Iran enriches that uranium to make maybe a nuclear bomb. But we are not making our own technologies, I think, which is important, I think, going forward. And then Claire made a very good point about the limited responsibility of an ICT professional. We saw that at Google when Timid Gebru tried to surface some concerns about the language model at Google, how she ended up, sacrificing her own career at Google. Same applies to a number of whistleblowers. We have really tried to do good work about surfacing some concerns, but we all know their fate, that there's only so much an ICT professional can do unless structural and institutional arrangements are evaluated and addressed. So there's a writer who's called Shannon Valler. Shannon Valler wrote an article yesterday, actually, said, we used to be excited about technology. He said, way back when we bought a fridge, we knew that a fridge was about storing food for our food to remain in good shape. And then we knew what a fridge was meant to do. So when daddy or mom brings a fridge home, we are all excited, is it? But now, the philosophy of technology, or the philosophy towards manufacturing of technology, has changed, because that fridge comes with maybe some cameras, with some sensors, not only to collect your data, but because the manufacturer of a fridge is not satisfied that you have paid probably a couple of thousand rands for that fridge, but they want to continue harvesting your data in order for that data to give them more profit for the next 10 years, for as long as that fridge is functional. So what is actually lacking is there's lack of a moral compass or values in the technologies, or in the ethos, or in the reasons why technologies are being manufactured now. Because everything is now data-driven, it's now profit-driven. So how do we go back, as an average ICT professional in South Africa, how do we go back to the original values? And which ones are these values? So it doesn't just concern Africa. I was reading remarks by Mark Girolami, the newly appointed chief scientist at Alan Turing Institute in London. Mark said, technology is only part of the solution. As an institution, we are also equally involved in thinking about ethical and regulatory issues. That is essential, that as a society, we get it right. And then he went on about talking about, their computer science graduates, how they need to be equipped with education and privacy, security, provenance, and legal aspects, governance aspects, political aspects of technology, which a number of computer science graduates traditionally have not been taught in, but some are very, very excited to take part in. So it's about the values, it's about how we are training our ICT professionals and what sort of values are we talking about. So in Europe, for example, a number of legislation, from the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, the new AI Act, which is trying to inculcate European values in technology. So Europe is taking normative leadership, but where is Africa in the mix? Africa, this is where we need to appeal to our own values of Ubuntu. And in the paper that I wrote, I talk about Ubuntu because Ubuntu is based on the ethos that we should see that our humanity in others or others' humanity in us is an ideal starting point in implementing the artificial intelligence universal principles that have been written and published in the past 2 years. So this is where I believe, I think Africa can come very, very strong. This is where I believe, I think Africa's contribution to the world is actually at its strongest because of our values, which is not just values, but because African labor, our intellectual labor, our physical labor have already powered previous industrial revolutions. We've got a precedence. So we are not just talking of Ubuntu, saying that Ubuntu is important in abstract. It's an ethos that came out of struggle. When Africans were taken into slavery, we see Ubuntu ethos, although it's not written explicitly in Du Bois' writing. We see Ubuntu in Nelson Mandela's writing. We see Ubuntu in Mahatma Gandhi's writing, although it's not explicitly written that this is Ubuntu, but we see that humanity. So these are global figures. We see Ubuntu in Obama's writing. So my argument here is that if Africans, I think like Desmond Tutu said that Ubuntu is our greatest gift to the world. But I believe, I think we are simply parodying Ubuntu. It has become very stylish to say, well, Ubuntu is the in thing, let's just talk about it. But unless we can show the world what we have to offer, that right now, as we talk, the vice president of technology and society at Google is an African, is a Zimbabwean. Right now, I've got African billionaires in the UK. We have got a UK prime minister who is from India. So I'm not just talking about Ubuntu as an abstract concept, but I'm talking about Ubuntu as a principle, as a theory that came out of the struggles of people of color, Black people, including Indians, because they were also colonized. So when I'm talking of the Ubuntu ethos, I think we should be pointing out to the world that I think we want the Ubuntu moral philosophy to guide this particular decision, because look at our history, look at how we have contributed to where the world is, but look at how we were excluded in the past industrial revolutions. So there's three dangers. I know there might be some questions. There are three dangers if Africa is not included in the fourth industrial revolution. I spoke about that Africa might actually be excluded on the basis of protected characteristics, that is on the social level. We saw like Google classifiers not being able to identify Black faces. But secondly, Africa is being excluded at the economic level. But thirdly, I think more importantly, Africa is being excluded or is excluding itself on the most important level that is contributed to the global AI ethics principles. You remember I spoke at the beginning that ethics is about how we relate to each other. What shall we do? How shall we relate to this social group? How shall I relate to this particular individual? So the nations that are leading in framing the ethics principles are the nations that are going to lead in the fourth industrial revolution. It's not about technology. It's not so much about data. It's about the countries that are leading in drafting the ethics principles. Let me just emphasize that by an example. England became one of the sports powerhouses, even in football, because it wrote the rules of football. Even if we know that I think some of the brilliant footballers come from Portugal and Spain. But why England is so good at football? Because it wrote the rules. Today, England and Wales are known as one of the best jurisdictions in the world, or the financial hub of the world is in London because of its legal system. It's about the rules. It's a society that has got rules. So it's on the basis of rules that I think we find that countries like the UK leading the world. And then when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution, I believe England is already forging ahead of most nations in risk compliance, in AI auditing. England is going to be the hub of the world in terms of writing the rules of artificial intelligence. Forget about the European Union. I don't think the European Union is going to be England. So the nation, or the nation that sets the rules, is the one that is going to play the game, that is going to beat other nations in the AI race. Just watch my words. So where is Africa in this game? Africa, we are lagging behind. We are not really competing. We are not tapping into our heritage and putting our heritage down on paper to say, and being assertive in the global forums that we should be included and we should be writing the rules. We should be including on the table. We should be included when Google, Facebook, Amazon are deliberating. We should be having Africans who know how to contribute. So let me hand it over back to Josine.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very passionate plea. So what spoke to me is when you said, so you're referring to a couple of people. By the way, Mahatma Gandhi has done a lot of work here in Johannesburg, not far from where I stay, because he worked with the miners, the Chinese miners here in Johannesburg. But I'm digressing now. But if we speak about, like Tutu said, Ubuntu is our gift to the world, then in a practical sense, how do we actually give that gift to the world? What should Africans be doing to make sure that that Ubuntu voice is being heard?
I think it's about being who we are inside. I think these days there's a word which is called manifestation. Manifestation, I think is, I don't know whether you've heard about that word. It's usually spoken in these movements that talk about, is it anthropology or, but I think let me just give you an example of Africans that I know. Christy Claassen, I think, was listening today. If you were to ask us, I think, what is Christy known for here in the Netherlands? She's known for being a nice person. She's a good person who contributes, who is very helpful. She's a true embodiment of what it means to be African. I know my answer is too abstract, but if you look, I think, at the root of every African who has become successful in the global arena, there's this Africanness about them. I think look at Didier Drogba when he was in London, when he was, people would call him a monkey and all that, but yet this resilience to say that, no, my ancestors went through that. They were called monkeys, they were called baboons, they went into slavery, but I'm going to be the best footballer for Chelsea. He was not dissuaded. So I think Ubuntu for me has become a slogan, and sometimes we don't really live to its values, to its true values of resilience, moral courage, but not just being called a monkey and then you don't challenge. One person I think who is actually known for speaking for Africa in every forum. It's not a coincidence that among 200 researchers in this country, I'm the only Black person. It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that today I edit for Stanford. I never went to an Ivy League school. It's not a coincidence, but it speaks to the qualities that you have, that you're a strong person. Yeah. An African should be strong, should be morally courageous, should be kind, should speak truth to power, but with kindness. Not with aggression, but with passion to say, I think this is who I am. So I think when it comes to making, I think how Ubuntu should work, I think I would refer to the Jews, how the Jews work together. Jews create a corner for each other wherever they go in the world. You don't even need to be told that's a Jew. They give each other businesses, they work together. That's what we need to do as Africans as well. So I don't know whether I've answered the question.
Unmuted, sorry. So I hear a bit what you say. So also, It's that so manifestation. So that's almost what Gandhi used to say. Be the change you want to see. If you want to achieve something, you need to incorporate it yourself and then manifest it. That's what you're saying. Anyway, yeah. So I see a hand from Christy. She first of all thanked you for the compliment earlier, but now she also welcome, Christy.
Hi everyone. Hey Arthur. So yes, there's been so much said that my answer might be a bit, or my comment might be a bit, all over the place. I think we need to distinguish between two parts of this discourse, right? And I'm also thinking of Claire's comment when you said that, there's only so much an ITC professional can do. So on the one hand, yes, that's true. There's only so much an ITC professional can do in the face of Google or Amazon or whoever's using data or collecting data. And, we have limited capacity to influence certain debates. That I think is something that we need to be realistic about, and that we need to definitely try and shape the discourse in, but know that, okay, there is this system that is not always fair and that is exploitative that we need to try and resist. That's on the one hand. I think when it comes to how Ubuntu can practically shape the discourse, this is where the question gets more interesting to me. In the European discourse, there's a lot of discussion on value-sensitive design when it comes to AI. Which kind of values do we need to keep in mind with the design of AI technologies? Also, the choices of which technologies to invest in. And there's this discourse that is happening. There's a discourse on techno-moral scenarios. So what could the potential future possibilities for these technologies hold? Most of these discourses are very Eurocentric, right? I know the US also takes part, but there's a lot of exclusion, I think, still, even though there's much more awareness of the global south being excluded, there's still a lot of exclusion because there's so much funding and the discourse is unequal. So what I do think ITC professionals can play a role in is when it comes to the discussion of ethics, the set of ethics or the set of moral values that we use for value sensitive or other kinds of design processes needs to come from somewhere, right? And this becomes, to me, a question of taking up space in the global discourse. And how do we become a part of this discourse that's so focused on the global north? How do we get people who actually work on a daily basis in the ITC world to be part of this discourse? This is the more tricky question, where where I would also like to know how we can do that. That's part of my research as well. So I'm kind of asking questions that I'm trying to find answers to. But how can the values, how can Ubuntu values that we know in practice and that we hopefully somehow integrate into our professional lives, how can that translate into this bigger discourse? And yeah, there I get sometimes a bit stuck, because Ubuntu, people with strong beliefs in Ubuntu are usually, not the ones at the center of discussions on techno-moral scenarios, ethical futures, and all these kind of discourses. So yeah, Arthur, how do we infiltrate this conversation in a way where African values can, I think, play a more, central role?
Because of our time, I think.
Yeah.
I believe in, I think, the deontology, that I think systems are good. Sometimes I think in Africa, we lack systems. Like, I think sometimes we talk about Ubuntu, but if you were to, I were to say, Christy, show me a paper, just a document where Ubuntu is nicely written as you might actually not find any. Maybe it's just written in academic articles. We need a tradition of putting things down, our heritage, our values down on paper. So we should, but why am I bringing this issue about deontology ethics? Because in the global fora, I think the issue of virtue ethics is being dismissed as well, to say, oh, virtue ethics, Aristotelian ethics, that's an old-fashioned thing. But I also believe, I think where Africans are very strong is when it comes to virtue. Because I was reading books about African leaders way, way back, not only just men, but women, who were very strong in defending their kingdoms and who were of high philosophical caliber, who ruled over large territories and who ruled over long periods of time. But I'm not talking of dictators. I'm talking of leaders who had a good heart for people. So virtue is an important part of who we are as Africans. So if we go to global fora and people say, no, virtue ethics no longer has a place to play. Because I think in the wake of the pandemic, some people were saying, no, rules are not working. Systems are not working. The systems that we designed are not working. We saw that when South African aeroplanes, flights were excluded from coming to Europe. So the COVID pandemic actually showed us that I think virtue-led leadership, virtue leadership is actually more in demand today, where we are facing polarization, post-truth, and all sorts of, I think, evils in the world. So Africans, the manifestation can never be separated from our virtue as people who are strong, people who have suffered, people who have been oppressed, people who are still seeking, who are on a resonant journey to seek our liberation. So that's part of our virtue, that's part of our moral courage as a people. We are also very emotional people. When I talk, I'm always very emotional, but it doesn't mean that I'm angry. That's who I am. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, wonderful. So you already said, Arthur, considering the time, we need to start wrapping up. There's a few comments that have come in. Not really questions, but I think interesting comments to share. So from Nathan Ross, who spoke earlier, he says, I think Ubuntu can be an ethical principle that exists alongside fairness and data minimization, etc. And also from Claire, who contributed earlier, says one should note that EU values are themselves not unified. For example, note issues in former Eastern Bloc countries like Poland and Hungary. And in the EU, to an extent, informing populations, so that is customers, has put some manners on tech companies. And then I've got a comment from Takura, who is also a member of our Social and Ethics Committee. He says, the Woman King movie. I think that's also, I don't know if you know that movie. Yeah. So thank you very much, Arthur. I think it was, very passionate about including Ubuntu in the global AI ethics discourse. I think for all of us, being here in Africa, being IT professionals, you actually made a call to us, I think, that we should, wherever we go, manifest that we are Africans and that we incorporate values of Ubuntu, and we just need to share them far and wide with the rest of the world, and also make a specific effort to become part of the global fora where ethics are being discussed. So thank you so much on behalf of the Social and Ethics Committee from the IITPSA. Thank you, Tony, for setting it up. And Arthur, I really hope that we will meet again. It was great to see Christy also attending, because we have been talking before about, how do you, in a more practical sense, if you're an IT designer, developer, implementer, if you develop something new, how do you include values? So there's even there are some. It's the mediation theory on technology. and the ethical guidance principles around that. So I think that will be a very interesting topic for a future webinar. So thank you so much. Comments coming in, people talking about that it was an inspiring session, lovely meeting us all, and very thought-provoking. And I think that's what we aim to do. Thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and hope to see you again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.